Hello, my friends. It is Big Nate again, back from a quite long illness. And Star Trek Discovery finished last month. Let's talk about it for a while. We're going to go into this a bit raw as I haven't written anything down. I've quite literally just seen the ending. And the only thing I can say is I'm happy it's gone. Star Trek Discovery was one of those shows I had the highest hopes for. I'd been watching Star Trek since the 1990s through The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise. So when those ships and those crews went away, I was always rewatching their shows. When I went through the uh, worst of my mental breakdown in my early 20s, those shows were there to pick me back up as a sort of comfort food. So when it was announced that they were doing Star Trek again, originally with the J.J. Abrams movies. I was hyped. I really wanted to see it. I was hoping it was going to be something interesting, something new. And yeah, we got the J.J. Abrams movies, which was more action Trek than Star Trek, following the vein of the more action orientated Star Trek films of the next generation. And while those films have enjoyable parts about them, they're more action than adventure with Star Trek. There has to be a healthy balance of both. So in 2017, when Paramount announced that they were bringing back Star Trek again, I was hyped, but this time I had an air of caution to go with it. And as the date drew nearer for the show being aired, we started getting leaks, and these leaks left me with very little hope that this was going to be a good Star Trek show because we found out originally they released it. It was going to be an anthology series following the ship as it went through its life cycle in Starfleet. Then that changed to it's going to be Spock's brother. To it's Spock's sister. First one I can forgive because Cyborg. Spock never mentioned Cyborg, and then we get a sister. I was like, okay, maybe there was a similar incident with Cyborg, and that's why he doesn't mention the sister. And then we started getting photo leaks, and we saw the Gundabad Klingons, and things kind of went downhill from there for me. So I went into Star Trek Discovery expecting very little, and it gave me less. The first episode, where we met these new design Klingons, I was sitting there going, well, where are the other Klingon designs? Where are the other branches of the Klingon genetic family tree? Because we know from Enterprise, the series previous to this in the timeline, that there should be smooth headed Klingons. That same type of Klingon that was in Star Trek, the original series. And there should also be Klingons of the TNG variety that didn't lose their cranial ridges due to the augment virus. And then we see these brand new Klingons. And only these brand new Klingons, which spun me out a bit from the show. And then as the episode went along, we saw ships that were vastly more technologically advanced than anything Starfleet had in supposedly in that timeline, as we get a glimpse from TOS's Constitution class. And then as the series progressed, there were more and more and more derivations that were just there to be there, or at least that's what it felt like. So I kept up with Star Trek Discovery through season 2, and then I dropped off completely. First time ever I've ever just completely dropped a Star Trek anything. And I would dip in every now and again, and then I dip out because it was just a continual mess of canon, and I just couldn't get back into it. So when it was announced that this season 5, was going to be the last season, I thought I'd go in and I'd force myself to sit through Star Trek Discovery. So the series itself, seasons 1 to 5, are broken up into two blocks. The first block is the TOS, pre TOS timeline, and then the second block then um, is the um, is the future timeline where they've gone through time to the future. For the TOS timeline, there's a lot of contradictions in there, stuff that should have been affecting the Kirk sort of era in there. Um, Most of all, the gigantic size of this new TOS constitution, because it looks absolutely huge, and it is over the size of the original, which is completely canon contradictory. We uh, we meet species that aren't in TOS at all, and I can understand some of that. And the species we do see in TOS are radically different from what they're shown as in Discovery. So it's all a bit contradictory to the established timeline of Star Trek. Now, I could forgive this if, when they shot over to the future, they met a guy like Daniels and he said, "Well, basically, your entire timeline is a derivative timeline." People were messing with that entire era in the temporal Cold War, and because of that, you've been written in and written out of history a million times. And the temporal directive thought it would be better to kick you guys to the future instead of leaving you back here because would be more useful there than here, or something of that variety. Um, and one of the other major issues with Star Trek Discovery is we don't know the crew. Now, I don't expect to know every single crew member because that would be ridiculous. There's hundreds of crew on a starship. What I do expect, though, is to have a full cast of characters that Star Trek is built around because it is a series that is built around its characters. In TOS, we had Spock, McCoy, Kirk as the three main characters, and then we had the side characters of Scotty, Sulu, Uhura, and then later on, Chekhov. In TNG, we had Picard, Riker, we had Data, we had Doctor Crusher, we had Wesley Crusher, we had Geordie LaForge, Deanna Troy. These are characters that we know. And then they brought Guinan in later on. These are characters that we know. I know more about Geordie LaForge than I do about any other character outside of Michael Burnham, Saru, and Tilly. I know more about Data than I know about Saru. I know more about Riker than I know about Tilly. It's these bridge characters as well. These characters we see on the bridge every single time we're on the bridge. We don't know anything about these characters. To one point, they had that woman who's like a robot with a human brain in there, and she sacrifices herself in season 2 to stop the AI that was already an AI because it was already self-determining. And even though it thought that it needed something else to be a full AI, I didn't know that character. I didn't know she had a husband and kids. I didn't know that until well into that episode, and she had been in almost every single episode of Discovery to that point. When you have a series, when you have to focus on a ton of characters, you sprinkle in bits of lore for them. With Data, we learned that he wanted to be a human in the first episode, and we saw his journey go along. His sidesteps, his quibbles, his turns, his forcing Starfleet to acknowledge that he was a living, breathing being, and we saw him become more and more human as the show went on. His father developed a program for him to access so he could have dreams. He could have had emotions had his brother not stole them in the series, and he had some later on in the films. With Geordie LaForge, we see him as a young ensign becoming the chief engineer of the Enterprise. We see how badly he does with relationships. We know about his relationship with his mother, who disappeared along with her ship and crew. We know about Riker's tumultuous relationship with his father and his wish to become captain of not just any ship, but the captain of the Enterprise. He wanted Picard's chair, but he didn't want to usurp him for it. He wanted to earn it from him. We saw Worf evolve from this one note character that everyone ignores when he brings a tactical option to a fully realized character. He had a son who he wanted to mold into the perfect warrior, but his son didn't want to be that, and he had to come to terms with that. With these Discovery characters, I barely know the vast majority of the named cast, and if you ask me to name any of these characters outside of the three I've already mentioned, I would be hard pressed to do so because the show didn't care enough to make these characters into people before the end of the show. But the one thing that really undermined this Star Trek for me was that I was at the time, and I still am, completely sick and tired of time travel Star Trek. I was getting burned out with it in Star Trek Enterprise because temporal Cold War seemed to be propping up in the most inopportune times in that series. They were trying to make it a thing, and it continued to just annoy me, and I know a lot of other fans that were just annoyed by it as well. And then you had the J.J. Abrams Star Trek, and all of it was because of a timeline thing. So by the time I got to Discovery, I was already predisposed to not liking time travel stories, and that's what this whole thing felt like. Oh, they're not in the canon. Why are they not in the canon? And then the writers had to struggle to change that, to kick them off. Then nobody knows who these people are anymore because it's been classified by by Starfleet, as if that would actually help any. It would have been easier to say that the Discovery had been lost with all hands, and then classify the real reason in the computers. Because I want you to think about this for a moment. A Starfleet ship isn't just the bridge crew. It's the engineering staff, it's the cleaning staff, it's the medical staff, it's all these tons of people. All of these people have families. The ships have to go into star bases. Every one of these star bases has a log of this ship. People who've worked and designed on that ship who've written logs about that ship. So you have to then go into every single one of those people's personal logs and their professional logs and edit out the discovery. It would have been easier to say the ship was lost with all hands instead of it didn't exist in the first place. That was then retconned later on in Strange New Worlds, but it was one of those things that really annoyed me at the time. And they shouldn't have to change stuff in a later series to make the stuff in the previous series seem more um, plausible. And it felt like, as the series went on, that they just didn't give a damn about Star Trek and that they were just throwing everything at the wall and trying to get stuff to stick. This series, if it didn't have the Star Trek name on it, would have been a good series. It would have been an expanded, interesting series. It didn't need to be Star Trek, it could have been anything. But because it's Star Trek, it comes with baggage. You can't place it in the timeline willy nilly because everything that happens in a universe happens like a stone being dropped into a pond. It ripples out from there. So any major event that you do in that series has to affect all the other series set in and around that timeline. Star Trek Enterprise got away with it because it was so far in the back. But if you go to an episode of TNG season 7, where you get the environmental episode where all ships are permanently stuck at warp 5 because of environmental reasons with the engines. That is then passed on to Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Voyager. But with Voyager, they were very clever. They said, oh, this new warp drive that the Voyager has eliminates that possibility altogether. So it cause effect change from one series to another. You can't just drop a war into Star Trek like the one they have there in Discovery and not have it affect anything else. Now, we know about the 4 Years' War because of dialogue and stuff from the original series and from Next Generation. We don't know a great deal about it. Similar to the Romulan Wars, these are wars in the past that we don't know a lot about, but but have huge ramifications in the timeline. So I was a bit iffy when they put this up as what they were doing, and then to watch it go. Sometimes you'd have episodes where you would feel that they were in the war and everything would feel serious, and you'd be like, "Oh, this is very serious. The events are happening. These people are dying." And then in other episodes, it was like you were the furthest from the war you could possibly get, as if there was no war happening in the first place. And then when they went off into the mirror timeline and came back, and you saw the amount of territory that the Federation had lost, and that the Klingons were knocking on the door of Sol, and then they had to bring a contrived reason why that had to not be completed, why the Klingons had to pull back. That pulled me out of the show like nothing else. If you're going to have a war in the show, it's going to affect everything that's going to go forward in that show. You have to give serious thought to how that war is executed. Because if you look at how much territory they lost and you equivocate it to a war that happened on Earth, you could say the Second World War, and the Federation would have been France because of the amount of territory they lost, but that was an automatic loss for France. The Battle of France, France lost because the Germans had spearheaded its way through the country, had split the British army from the French army, and then encircled Paris and forced them to surrender. What did the Klingons do? They had penetrated deep into Federation territory, forced their way through, and were knocking on the door of Sol, which had Earth, which was the capital of the Federation. The French surrendered twice when this happened, once in World War II and once in the Franco Prussian War. You cannot have a deep, deep penetration like that into your territory without there being serious ramifications and repercussions. And these are not felt from season 1 to season 2. What did Starfleet do to make sure this would not happen again? What did Starfleet do to ensure that this would not happen again? We don't see any of it. In fact, there is almost zero ramifications from losing that vast swath of territory and almost losing the war. There's nothing. And the really ridiculous contrivance of we've put a bomb in the middle of the core of the Klingon planet of Kronos, and we'll set it off if you don't bring peace to us. I don't think the Klingons would care. I don't think the Klingons give a damn about Kronos. I think the Klingons would have loved to have taken Earth because that would have shattered the Federation, and they could have made Earth a a slave planet for which they expand out from. But it's just one of those things where you have to give real thought because the Klingons are an expansionist empire. And what do empires usually do with the people they conquer? Especially empires in Africa and in Asia, they take the people and they enslave them. And that is what the Klingons would do. It's what they would have done with the Gorn if they could have gotten away with it in the Star Trek Online series. The Klingons are a pragmatic species, but everything in this series we've seen has shown them to be ridiculous. They have weird ship designs that make no tactical sense. They have warriors that have giant bat'leths where the blades are pointed at them instead of away from them. I just feel this show could have used more preparation and more understanding of the timeline in this TOS block. But as we move into the future, you had all the freedom in the world to do what you wanted, and they even somehow managed to mess that up. So we move in with the end of the TOS block, where the Star Trek Discovery and the Starship Enterprise are engaging Section 31's AI forces, and they have a vast number of starfighters or battle pods in their inventory of their ships. Bit ridiculous that they should carry that amount of starfighters, and why wouldn't any other ship carry them, and why is this the only time we ever see them? These are questions that don't get answered. So they're just going to leave that and go. So we enter into this wormhole and we shoot to the future, the far, far future, past even the era of the temporal Cold War, into a alpha quadrant that has been completely shattered because dilithium no longer exists. Now, I could get behind that somewhat if there weren't other engine systems that didn't need dilithium to exist. What do I mean by that? Well, Zephram Cochrane didn't have any dilithium in his warp engine. In the original canon of Star Trek, before Enterprise was put in, Starfleet um, didn't have dilithium warp cores until the Enterprise, and then that got retconned later. So there is a way to have warp drive without dilithium. It's just more fuel hungry and less powerful. I mean, the Romulans didn't have dilithium when they were fighting the United Earth Starfleet. They were using fission power to make their warp drives. They didn't have dilithium power until they started trading with the Klingons in the TOS era. And then after the TOS era in TNG, they weren't using dilithium for their engines then either. They were using a quantum singularity, which, if you watch the Star Trek series, their deflector arrays can create quantum singularity, so it doesn't seem like there needs to be any dilithium there. And given the vast amount of time between TNG and this new far future block of Star Trek Discovery, you would have assumed that they would have used some of the Borg's technology to improve their own. Those power nodes that the Borg had. I can't remember if they were 0 point energy or not, but they were these hugely powerful nodes all over the Borg ships that have a non centralized power core. You'd have thought Starfleet would have moved on to something like that. No. Everything is still dilithium powered, and all the dilithium in the galaxy supposedly destroyed in a single day. So you have an empire as vast as Starfleet that's suddenly shattered overnight. Interesting concept, poor execution, which I think is the epitaph of the entire series, as we find out that the reason there's no dilithium was because this one being uh, screamed, and all of the dilithium was somehow on the same frequency as his scream, and all the dilithium in the galaxy shattered all at the same time. That is in the realms of science fantasy so far that it is practically sniffing Star Wars. And I don't mean to be attacking Star Wars fans here, but Star Trek is usually a lot more grounded with its absurd sciences than it is with than Star Wars usually is. They and they got to move on from there. And I was when I saw that episode, I was like, why in the name of God would you do that? Why? That just seems ridiculous. How does a being screaming on one planet, not even a planet, on one like asteroid field, if I remember right, asteroid field, echo out through the entirety of the galaxy? That doesn't make any sense. But that's what they went with, so they got to move forward from there. And so that series ends with that big discovery. Ugh. Then we get another AI plot, which continues on from the same sort of boring AI plot season one Picard had. And then we get the end of Star Trek Discovery, where they have this poignant moment where Michael Burnham, Spock's sister, is sitting on the bridge of the Discovery for the last time as an admiral, and then she shoots off into warp and away with the new AI with the AI that's in the computer. As I said previous, Star Trek Discovery, if it wasn't Star Trek and was just another science fiction show, probably would have done better than having all the baggage that came with Star Trek, even in the far future, because you've bungled it so completely. There seems to be no thought put into any of the far-reaching consequences here. It'll be the equivalent of, oh, there was a nuclear world war in the 1990s, cool, and then everything is as it is now, because it's like, well, what about the radiation, the fallout? Oh no, it's fine now. There has to be consequences to the actions from episode to episode, as there has been in Star Trek since Deep Space Nine. You cannot go the Voyager route and completely reset the entire universe every episode, because people start falling off from it because there's no consequences, as they did with Voyager. And it just feels like they didn't learn anything and didn't want to learn anything, and they were just throwing concepts that
But
were
they
granted
had
interesting
no
concepts grounding. They had no ability to create these concepts while keeping to the chain that Star Trek had, the chain of events, the chain of the timeline, everything that Star Trek is laid out with. So, say there was a massive war, and Starfleet won, but they won because of underhanded means. And then you have a series that explores Star Trek after that point. You can't have people treating the Starfleet as they would have treated Starfleet in TOS or TNG, because they've done it in an underhanded manner. People are going to be more shifty around Starfleet, like, oh, I don't trust these people. Why don't you trust them? Well, because they unleashed a Tholian or a Thaleron radiation bomb to deal with the Tholian Empire. That sort of thing. So there's a consequence to the underhanded action that they took. With Star Trek Discovery, it just didn't feel like they had any inkling to do that, and they just had writers going off writing interesting concepts with no means to link it to each other and no means to link it to the overarching story. Now, was there a through line in each one of these series? Yes, there was, but they weren't very good at keeping to it, which is the main issue of Star Trek Discovery. The characters were interesting, but they were poorly done, those that they decided to take any interest in. I was invested in Tilly's wish to become a Starfleet captain in season one, but by the end of the series, I was annoyed with Tilly enough that I didn't really care anymore. Saru had a sort of interesting story with his little forgiggly gland at the back of his head popping up every time death was near, but that turned out to be something that his species got rid of naturally, but none of them lived long enough to do it. That was a bit interesting. I was hoping we'd have a little bit something a bit more interesting with him, and they did in the later season, where it turns out it was one of his species that was responsible. But there's got to be a reaction from that instance. Like this, his species was responsible for the destruction of the dilithium because one of his species did it. So there's got to be entire races out there that, when they find that out, want to genocide those species, but there doesn't seem to be any reaction from anyone. Like, we discovered this is the reason for the burn. Cool. Who was responsible? Well, not anyone was responsible because of XYZ happened, and then you have people saying, well, because that happened because of this person, ergo this person is evil, and any of his species are evil as well, because that's the kind of small mind thing that happens naturally in people. And none of it felt like that in Star Trek Discovery, which is disappointing. So if I were to say anything about Star Trek Discovery, I would say that it was wasted potential. that it was an interesting concept that would have been better served in a non-Star Trek series. A concept that, if it was an original premise, an original series, probably would have landed better than if you try to sandwich that interesting series into Star Trek, because Star Trek has a voice, it has a canon, and it has decades and decades of that canon. You can't make quick changes to it because people won't allow it. They would reject it outright because it doesn't fit in with the established canon, and then you have to bend backwards in order to try and fit it in. This was the problem with Star Trek Discovery. And even when they took it to the far future, you still have to give it the voice of Star Trek. An original series doesn't have that issue. An original series would have established its own voice and then grown from there, which this series, given the writing in it and the money spent on it, could have done very easily, and they could have just rested the Star Trek franchise. So, my summing up of Star Trek Discovery is, if I was going to mark it out of 10, it would be a 4.5. Because while the concepts are interesting, the story is interesting, it simply isn't Star Trek, and there's too much derivation for it to even be considered it. But it did give us something like Strange New Worlds that, while a poor interpretation of Star Trek, still feels more like Star Trek than Discovery. It also gave us Picard, that had two of the worst series of a science fiction I have ever seen. I think Andromeda Season 5 was better than that. Or Andromeda Season 4. I can't remember when they finished off the top of my head right now. But yeah, that was terrible. But it ended with such a good note with Picard Season 3 that most people are willing to somewhat forgive the terrible Star Trek Picard Seasons 1 and 2. And we also got an interesting animated series out of it. I'm personally quite enjoyed Lower Decks as a concept. Execution wise, it's a bit more comedic than I'm used to with Star Trek, but as it's a cartoon, I can forgive it. But yeah, Star Trek Discovery, it opened the door for this new era of Star Trek, and while it's not the golden age and there's more misses than hits, it is still nice to see Star Trek back. And on that somber note, I will leave you. I am Nate the Chronicler, Big Nate, as it says. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you didn't, leave a comment. Let me know where I can improve. I will catch you guys somewhere down that road. Have a nice day, guys.